if you are tuning in to see our December Nature 101 Baby It's Cold Outside program, we've had some minor technical difficulties with our recorded version of the program. I am, sorry, messing with the controls. I'm not sure that I'm going to have enough cell signal to live stream, so here at the top of the program, I'm just going to say, things start cutting in and out, I'll wrap things up, and then we'll get that recorded version uploaded this afternoon, since that will be continuous and without interruption. But I figured maybe this was a sign that with the end of the year, we would be able to live stream again. So, I'm gonna give it a go. And we'll start off with our traditional welcome to the Highlands Botanical Garden. We are here for our December Nature 101 program, Baby It's Cold Outside. My name is Paige Engelbrektsson, and I am the Nature Center Education Specialist for the Highlands Biological Foundation, which supports natural history research and education in the Southern Appalachians, primarily here at the Highlands Biological Station through programs like this one. And I am very excited that we may be able to pull off a live stream. Again, if we can't, I will be uploading a recorded version of this program later. But since it is live, please feel free to chime in with your thoughts, your questions. It would be amazing to get to talk to people, even if it's over over Facebook. Again, I have missed you guys while we've had to record. So keep your fingers crossed. I've got enough cell signal to make this work, and we will see how it goes. If you are not familiar with our Nature 101 program, it is a monthly series in the off-season where we take a basic natural history topic or question and just spin it around and see if we can get the basic answer to it. So by the end of this program, you will not know everything there is to know, but you will have some foundational concepts. And the question we are asking today is, how do our wild animals survive the winter? If you guys have any thoughts or any animals you'd be most interested, please drop them in the chat. I have a few that I am prepared to talk about, but you never know, I might have a few others up my sleeve. The title of this program is very appropriate because it is cold outside, but fortunately with the sun, it is a little bit warmer than it would otherwise be. Howdy folks, thanks for joining me. Alright, so we're going to swing around here. And when we are trying to figure out how it is that our wild animals survive the winter, I find actually that there is another question we can ask that will help us figure that out. And that is, where is a given animal right now, today, at this time? For example, where do you guys think that we would be able to find a black bear on Tuesday, December 15th at 1 p.m.? If we went looking for them, where'd they be chilling? Sorry, I'm going to get in the shade here. So if you were to say that, oh, you could find a black bear digging through my trash or raiding my bird feeder for food, you would be right. Bears are notorious in the fall for eating anything that they can get their paws on because they are fattening up for the winter. If you think about what kinds of foods black bears rely on, what comes to mind immediately for me would be nuts, berries, other plant matter. Insect larvae are actually a big one, which is pretty cool. Those kinds of things you cannot find right now, and you will not find for months to come. So if a black bear were to be up roaming through the botanical garden all winter long, how do you guys think that would go for them? Probably not too great. They'd be spending a lot of energy and finding very little in the way of food to compensate for it. So, black bears say, okay, my food is going away and it's going to get cold. My best option is to sleep. They are fattening up. They are going to find some place to den that is dry, preferably sheltered from the elements. And then they are going to go to sleep for months. And when they do that, what they're able to do is actually reduce the amount of energy it takes to keep their bodies going to about a fourth of what it is during the summer. And that lets them draw on all the fat that they've added up this fall to keep them alive through to the spring. That is what we call hibernating. And it is a very common tactic, I'll tell you right now. Typically because food sources are going away or because the cold is an insurmountable challenge for the animals that we're talking about. So, here's my next question to you guys. Where do you think we would find black bears denning today? If they're not out and about, we're actually looking for them. Where do you guys think they're going to turn up? Any ideas? In this particular patch of the Botanical Garden, we have some things that echo the kinds of dens we might find black bears in. So this thicket of rhododendron, it's everywhere right here, it's everywhere across the plateau. If it is dense enough, you actually will be able to find black bears denning in the understory if it's relatively dry and relatively insulated from the weather. Up here, we've got a stump. If there was a large hollow stump, it's right here behind this rhododendron, or if there was a fallen tree that was hollowed out, you'd be able to find black bears there. If the ground was torn up where a tree had fallen over, exposing a big root ball, you might be able to find them there as well. But you may have noticed I'm not mentioning caves. And bears in caves is a very classic image, and that might be what comes to mind for you guys. Does anybody else have that reaction? I do. However, if you know the Highlands Plateau, do we have a lot of caves? Not really. And yet we have many, many black bears, which is why we find them in unusual spots like the rhododendron thicket or hollow logs. Or, and this one is really cool, scientists in the Smokies tracked black bears as they were going to their den, and they were finding them up in big old trees. So this is in silhouette, you can't really see, but some of these limbs on this tulip poplar are dying or dead. And before they fall off, there's the opportunity that they're going to start rotting, and when they fall off, they can create a cavity in the tree itself. If that cavity is big enough, we could find black bears up there. That's not the case for this particular tulip poplar. But in the Smokies, they found bears in big old cavities in big old trees. And that seemed, based on their studies, to be about 80% of bears were hibernating up in trees, which was frankly not something I was expecting to find. So that's pretty cool. Bears say, okay, food is going to be a huge problem for me, even if I could keep myself warm. So I am going to just sleep the winter away. And I gotta be honest, sometimes that sounds appealing for me. Anybody else wish that they could do that? You know, stock up at Thanksgiving, add on a couple 100 pounds, and then just snooze away. You will see black bears out and about if we have really warm days in the winter. They are not so deeply asleep that they will not wake up due to disturbance, like if you walk into their den, or if their weather might be warm enough for them to venture out and look for any food that's available. Here in the southern Appalachians, they do not hibernate for as long as bears in other parts of the country will. So, even black bears out to the coast of North Carolina will hibernate, but it's very brief and they have enough warm days that they are pretty active even in the winter. We're going to come back, actually, circle past the kiosk again. and head over to this tree to talk about the next animal that has a winter survival strategy. So, there is one animal that I associate with this owl box, and it is not an owl. And that is because on this little projection right below the owl box is where I will often see a red squirrel munching away. So here is my question to you guys. How do you guys think red squirrels survive the winter? What do they do? Any ideas? Well, if you think of them like chipmunks, it might be very tempting to assume that red squirrels sleep away the winter as well. We think of chipmunks stuffing their cheeks full, stashing food away, and then staying underground. We won't see them again till spring. But red squirrels, despite being a similar size to chipmunks, take a very different tactic. If we wanted to look for a red squirrel right now, we would not have to look very far. They are running all over the garden. I have heard them multiple times since coming down here to get ready for the program. I would not be surprised if one darted across the trail in front of me, because they are active all winter long. Now, why? Why can they be active all winter long? Well, food is a concern. They eat fungi, they eat baby birds, they eat nuts and seeds and pine cones, or the seeds from pine cones. These things are not going to appear over the winter. They have dropped off dramatically now, and they will not become available again until probably next spring. So what do red squirrels do? How do they make sure they've got enough food to stay active during the whole winter? I'll go show you. Red squirrels in the fall will actually harvest pine cones before they've opened and the seeds have fallen out. So presumably, if this were a new pine cone, there'd be seeds in there. And then they store them away so that later they can come back, pull the pine cones out, and eat them throughout the winter. And as you can tell by the vast amount of pine cone scales here, I believe this is an area where a red squirrel has cached a significant number of pine cones. Some places it sounds like they actually just stack them one on top of each other, so you'll just find huge mounds of nothing but pine cones, sometimes buried by leaves. Here, that doesn't seem to be the case. I've been looking around the Botanical Garden. I think it's possible that they're storing the pine cones underground in burrows, because red squirrels do have burrows that they will live in. And you can also find them in tree cavities, much like we talked about for the black bear, but understandably a slightly smaller version. So if our owl box actually had a bottom, you might expect potentially a red squirrel to be living in there. So by storing food for the winter, the red squirrel ensures that it can be active the entire time. And as a mammal, it's able to generate enough body heat to keep itself warm, so the cold isn't a big issue, which is pretty cool. You may also be more familiar with the gray squirrels, depending on where you are. They likewise are famous for digging up lawns as they're burying acorns. Similar idea. Chipmunks, they do store their food underground, but they don't come out. They are not above ground. Chipmunks will actually go to sleep for several days at a time, then wake up, eat a little bit, and go back to sleep, and repeat this throughout the winter. There's another relative of the squirrels, the woodchuck, that does not store any food for the winter. And so you can guess, if it doesn't store food and the plants that it depends on are in short supply during the winter, it's probably going to take a tactic of hibernating, like the black bear, which it does. They go into their burrows when it starts to get cold. They'll stay down there for months on end, living off of their stored fat, and then reemerge in the spring, which is how we get Groundhog Day. So. Have you guys seen groundhogs up here on the plateau? I have one. It's a nuisance around my property. But I was actually really surprised to learn that they're up here. I just assumed that there weren't the kinds of spaces I associated with them, or big fields, for example, are not commonly found on the plateau. So I was kind of surprised. So here we are at the edge of Lindenwood Lake, which is currently beautiful and crystal clear over here in the shallows. And if you've stopped by the Botanical Garden anywhere from the early spring to the late summer, you have probably heard frogs calling at the edges of the lake. So my question to you guys, feel free to drop an answer in the chat if you'd like, is where do you think we're going to find the frogs right now? Where could we find a frog today with all the cold that we've had and all the potentially inclement weather that we are going to be potentially getting tomorrow? Any ideas? Sorry, I'm super washed out. The thing to think about when we're asking the question, where can we find frogs, is to realize that unlike our black bears, and unlike our squirrels, and unlike us humans, they can't make their own body heat. So I am bundled up right now. I've got gloves, scarf, hat, because I'm trying to stay warm. But as a warm-blooded animal, I'm able to make enough body heat that I can keep my body temperature above the surrounding ambient air temperature, which is great because right now it's like 39 without the sun. And I appreciate not being 39 degrees Fahrenheit because if I was, I'd be close to being in high school. Frogs don't have that luxury. They're what we call cold-blooded, meaning that they can't increase or regulate their temperature. Whatever the surrounding temperature is, that's what they're going to be. So while I might be at 98.6 degrees body temperature right now, a frog out here in the open air would be 37 degrees Fahrenheit. And we had a good frost this overnight, so all the pitcher plants around me were covered in a beautiful layer of frost. If a frog had been out, it would have been frozen as well. And that is, I mean, you can probably guess, that's not great if you're trying to survive the winter. So what do you think frogs do? Where do you think frogs go? Any ideas? I'll give you a hint. It depends on what kind of frog we are talking about. So maybe it's a little bit of a trick question. If we are talking about a frog like the American bullfrog, and you said, well, maybe the frogs just stay in the water, you would be right. Imagine putting on our snorkeling gear and going out into Lindenwood Lake. Not here in the shallows, which could freeze, but farther out, deep, I would say probably a couple of feet deep at the minimum, we would see American bullfrogs just chilling like a villain on top of the mud, waiting. Because think about it. Even if the lake isn't frozen, and even if the air is warm enough for them to come out, is there anything for them to eat? There isn't. So between the cold and the lack of food, they just want to stay hunkered down for the winter, kind of like our bears. There's another option though. If you were to say, well, maybe the frogs come up and they dig into the ground the way that I know salamanders do, you would be right if we're talking about an American toad. I have them all around my cabin, and I have, and one very memorable occasion, I was working in my garden in the late fall and unearthed one, and we were both very surprised. But they will actually come out, find a place, dig down a burrow that's deep enough that the frost line, or where the ground will freeze to, won't get them, and then they will hang out in their burrows all winter long. Again, even if the air is warm, there's nothing for them to eat, so they will hang out down there. There is one other option left, though. Let me see if I can find him in here. Fanny packs are great, but not when you've got gloves on. If you thought, well, maybe we should look underneath the leaf litter, or maybe in a board, a log, or even some rock crevices, you would find spring peepers. These itty bitty guys will not spend the entire winter under the lake, and they aren't strong enough to dig, so they are going to come up on land and try and find some place around here that is similar to bears. It's warm and it's well insulated enough that it is unlikely to freeze. And then they are going to hunker down and wait it out. Which sounds an awful lot like black bears. And we can use the same term here. Frogs and toads hibernate, which is a pretty cool idea. It explains why you never see them in the winter until we get to a spring day with rain, and then they're all over the roads and you try not to hit them. Thank you on behalf of the frogs for trying not to hit them. So, between the cold, lack of food, hibernation is the way to go. I do want to point out that spring peepers and wood frogs are actually examples of a really cool adaptation where if they freeze, they can survive given a certain degree of freezing and for a certain amount of time. Wood frogs are touted often for their anti-freeze properties, where they're able to be partially frozen and then still thaw and be fully functional in the spring. And if you want to read more about that, there is tons of information out there, because it's a really cool idea. All right, and we're going to hope that I haven't jinxed myself by saying this, but I am very pleased that I am almost done with the program and still don't have any glitches in the signal. Fingers crossed that lasts. I do want to stay on Lindenwood Lake, though. So if you have been here in the summer and you've walked out to a little grassy area over there, or out onto the bank of the dam, you will have seen some of the quite stately, quite large, quite presumably elderly snapping turtles we have in Lindenwood Lake. So my question to you is, once again, where do you guys think we're going to find snapping turtles today, right now? Especially now that I'm in the shade and it's gotten colder. Oh. Any ideas? Well, if you are familiar with frogs being cold-blooded and unable to stay warm, you may be able to put two and two together and realize that reptiles, like snakes and turtles, are also cold-blooded and unable to keep themselves warm. That's why they have to bask in the sun. You can see them hauled out on logs sometimes. Yes, okay. Hi, Patricia. Patricia is on the mark when she says that we can find snapping turtles under the mud in the lake, because the same principle applies. Snapping turtles have to find somewhere to spend the winter where they will not freeze, because they cannot regulate their own temperature. If they are out here on land and it's frozen, they will freeze. It might be tempting to think that you will find snapping turtles in burrows, kind of like the American toad makes. But while we see them up on land digging nests in the spring to lay their eggs, they're going to spend the winter under the mud, similar to that American bullfrog. So the lake is very unlikely to freeze, and certainly not freeze very deep, which means similar to the bullfrog, if we were to go out and drop a couple of feet, if not all the way to the bottom, we would find snapping turtles buried with just perhaps their heads or their butts poking out into the water. And their butts become very important because here's a question for you. Snapping turtles need to breathe air. What do they do about oxygen if they're spending all winter buried in the mud? Any guesses? This one has a very amusing and delightful answer as to how they survive months buried. They are still alive even if their energy costs have dropped. So even if they're not using up a lot of energy, they're still using energy and oxygen, which means they need to get more oxygen. And in the summer, all they'd have to do is rise to the surface, take a breath, and be good. But if the lake is frozen over, that's not great. If it's too cold for them to really function well, they don't want to come out of the mud because they might expose themselves to predators like river otters. River otters will eat hibernating turtles. It's kind of gruesome. And we have river otters here. So it's safer for a snapping turtle to stay in the mud with their mouths out or their butts out. Because think about the other group of animals that doesn't have to come up to breathe water in the lake. Fish. Fish have very thin surfaces with lots of blood vessels that are able to pull oxygen from the water into the blood vessels and then for use in the body through that. In fish, that's done through a gill. Snapping turtles, do they have gills? Do they grow gills? They don't. But they do have a couple of surfaces of their on their bodies that are rich with blood vessels. One is the mouth. So you might see them under the mud with their mouths gaping to keep water circulating, to draw oxygen from the water onto their blood vessels. Another blood vessel rich part of a turtle is their butt. So in turtles, we call them, most reptiles, they have an opening that serves as their butt, which is called the cloaca. And that has a lot of blood vessels around and in it, which means a turtle can also poke its butt out of the mud and have water running across it and be drawing oxygen out of the water into their butts to use over the winter. So turtles, you could say, breathe through their butts while they're hibernating, which is just a really amusing thought for me. So I hope you guys appreciate that as well. So between the cold being a primary factor for snapping turtles, probably a little bit with food, but really cold, our snapping turtles survive the winter by hibernating. I told you guys it was a common survival strategy. Are there any other animals that you guys are curious about? Because we are coming towards the end of the program. Yes, way. Yeah, it's just these challenges that they have to overcome and develop adaptations or behaviors for. Nature is delightfully, wonderfully weird. And it's one of the reasons I love my job so much, is I get to do things like research turtle survival methods and then read about turtles breathing through their butts. So, bears, actually, interesting fact about bears when they hibernate, they don't eat, drink, pee, or poop. And that has some really interesting implications. Scientists are trying to figure out why their bones don't experience osteoporosis when they're stationary for months on end, and might be able to apply whatever they find to people. So nature's got all sorts of tricks up her sleeve. All right. Give you guys another shot of Lindenwood Lake. Ooh, okay. Patricia is asking about pollinators. The answer is yes. And bumblebees are a fantastic example of this. You will find bumblebees that burrow into the ground in areas that have a lot of leaf litter, kind of like the toad for the same principle. The idea is to get below where the ground can freeze with enough insulation from leaf litter that they'll survive. There are also other insects that will burrow into, I don't know that I have any good examples around here. I'm going to demo it. Many of our, right now I've just got a whole bunch of shrubs, unfortunately, but we have plants, perennial plants that have died, no, annual plants, my apologies, that have died, especially ones with larger stems. Some pollinators will actually burrow into these hollow stems and then stay there for the winter, so they're safe from predation. I'm not sure about the freezing aspect. And butterflies, some butterflies overwinter as pupa, as larvae, and as adults. So they don't have to come up from where it's warmer, they just have to survive the winter, and then they can emerge in the spring and get their life cycle going. Good question. I do want to give a caveat here, because if somebody with a natural history background is listening to this program and you have been silently screaming every time I say that bears hibernate or turtles hibernate, I apologize. For context, the processes that happen to different animals are, for example, what happens to a turtle in the winter versus what happens to a chipmunk versus what happens to a black bear can be very different. And scientists distinguish between these by referring to them with different terms. So a chipmunk, which just goes to sleep and then wakes up and then goes to sleep and wakes up, is what we call, is in a state called torpor. Same with black bears. They're not hibernating per se, they are in a state of torpor because they will easily wake up if the weather is good, or if somebody walks into their den, or if they have cubs. Females give birth during the winter. They are not asleep for that process, they are awake. In contrast, woodchucks that fall into a deep sleep and do not wake up for months on end, and will not wake up, are in what we might refer to as true hibernators. And then our amphibian and reptile friends are not hibernators. They go into a state called brumation. They brumate. It's like their version of things, but slightly different. And I went down a lot of rabbit holes trying to find like very clear-cut lines between these. But the more I kept looking into it, the more it seems like there's some fuzziness there. And the more I kept finding different definitions of what made one different from the other. So for simplicity's sake, we have referred to this all as hibernation. Shorthand. Especially when you're learning about the topic. You can get into the weeds later. If you have any other questions, please let me know. I'm going to make my standard pitch that if you are curious about our other programs, which I'm going to keep my fingers crossed and say we can live stream now, you can sign up for our e-blast at highlandsbiological.org. We will send you updates on upcoming programs and links to recordings and cool things that are happening around the station and at the foundation. Our next program is going to be on Monday, January 4th. It will be our monthly garden and every season tour. I'm thinking, here's some good examples. Maybe not. I'm looking for big hollow reed annuals, like maybe blackberry canes. Anyway, now I'm sidetracked. I'm thinking it's going to be a little bit more of a ramble than a organized program, what with the holidays coming up, but we will see when we get there. And as the holidays and the end of the year are coming up, Thank you very much, Patricia. I appreciate that. And thank you for tuning in. I'm so glad I get to talk to people again. You have no idea how good it feels. If you are enjoying these programs and considering your end of year giving, please consider making a donation to the foundation. They make all these programs possible. And so thank you to everybody who has supported us or is thinking about supporting us. You make sure that I can be here. You make sure that these programs can happen. And it brings me great joy to do them. If you are in town for the holidays, we are open. Well, the Botanical Garden is open dawn to dusk year-round, which is a much shorter period of time now, given that solstice is in just under a week. But we are still open. Bring a mask to wear if you encounter other visitors on the trail. Other than that, come see the beauty of a forest in winter. It has its own kind of grace. So I hope that you have fantastic holidays and a wonderful start to your new year. And I will talk to you in 2021. What's up with that? All right, folks. Take care. Bye.